After discovering signatures collected by Kennedy Enterprises on his behalf may be fraudulent, Republican gubernatorial candidate Walker Stapleton requested that his name be taken off the ballot this week. Stapleton will now attempt to make the ballot through the GOP State Assembly, which is held tomorrow on Saturday. David, Stapleton has been described as a front runner, so him going to the Assembly isn't a huge risk. I mean, anything can happen, obviously, but it seems that the bigger effect is going to be what his placement there and the votes that he will need, how that'll affect both Cynthia Kaufman and the other folks running. What do you think?
You know, for about 2 decades, I've been at this table with Patty, and whatever political race gets talked about and forecasting, Patty often says, oh, this race is going to be wild. And she's being very sincere, but it's said with, you know, it sometimes seems like the same person might be saying, oh, and you got to go to the student council meeting this week. It is going to be fantastic. But this time, it really has been wild. We have, before we've even got to the start line, 3 front runners out. George Brockler, he was the front runner about a year ago. Now he's running for Attorney General. Then Tom Tancredo was the front runner because of his name recognition and long political past. He's out. Ed Perlmutter, utter powerhouse congressman in Colorado, invincible in his district. He was the front runner. Now he's gone. And now we have another front runner who at least is in peril, because he's got to get to that 30% threshold. There's a lot of candidates out there, and anything can happen. And I think it took a lot of guts for him to pull his, say, decertify my petitions after the Secretary of State had already certified them. And people are trying to make political points on it. I think he did the right thing under the circumstances. And of course, on the Democratic side, also the state convention's going on. That's going to be a big thing. Is Jared Polis or Kerry Kennedy going to win the top line and thereby get front runner status? Is Mike Johnston going to be able to make a comeback from a very weak showing at the caucuses? And of course, this is the last stand for Donna Lynn, our current lieutenant governor, who may be out by Sunday, but we'll have to see, and maybe she can pull off some kind of miracle.
Penn, as a former lawmaker, while you haven't run for governor, you've been part of this process. You're familiar with the Assembly, the politics behind it. I'm not sure if you've seen one as crazy as the 2 we're going to see on Saturday, but as you see this big move this week and Walker Stapleton having already a point reserved, and Cynthia Kaufman, a few weeks ago when she decided to go through the Assembly, it was her and the also-rans, and no offense to Lou Gator and Greg Lopez and Steve Barlock, but yeah, let's just call it what it is. Now it's a totally different story. What do you think?
You know, this, David's right. This is going to be a student council meeting you don't want to miss on either side of the aisle. Walker Stapleton, I think it strains credulity to believe he paid a firm $200,000 and didn't know there were problems with the petition, especially when he hired a firm that's had this exact same situation before, as recently as 2014. So he knew what he was stepping into. Number 2, he had to ask the Secretary of State to pull his petitions, because now with all of these allegations and charges, he's just a sitting duck for more attacks if the petitions are sitting on Wayne's desk and his staff is trying to figure out which are valid, which are lies. And quite frankly, it puts Wayne at risk because he's just survived his own lawsuit. So Walker had to pull out. Now, the reality is doing that doesn't really hurt him, because it's hard for me to believe that between Cynthia and all the rest of those people you named that nobody else has heard of before, between all of them can get 75% of the delegates, which is what it would take to keep Walker off the ballot. He's got, I think, hit 30. So clearly Walker and Cynthia are going to hit 30. I don't think anybody else is going to get there. I don't think it matters who's top line at this point. It's amazing when I reflect on it, and you look at the list David just gave us of people who were in and out. If Cynthia had campaigned more aggressively early on, she might have been able to shut Walker Stapleton from reaching the ballot with this assembly, but you can't. On the Democratic side, it's a little different story. It's basically Kerry and Jared are the only two trying to get on the ballot through the caucus and assembly process. Again, neither of them is strong enough to stop the other from getting 30%. They'll be there. Mike Johnson has already pulled out of the assembly, and Donna Lynn was never going through the assembly. So they're going to get on the ballot through their petitions.
So Donna Lynn's only going through petitions?
Only going through petitions. She didn't go through the caucus or assembly process. Johnson started, but withdrew because he had a miserable showing through the caucus system. And so it's just the two of them in the Democratic side. It'll still be interesting.
Interesting is a nice word as a segue to you, Noel. What do you think is going to be the most interesting thing that you and your colleagues report on Sunday after these assemblies?
I guess the outcome and how it happened. I mean, we'll have we've got our entire political team is going to be spread out at these, and they'll be live tweeting, they'll be updating stories all day long. If you want to follow the horse race, denverpost.com will be your place to be. I just find this whole process fascinating, and these yahoos, as my Tennessee kin would say, out there collecting signatures. Like, who are these guys that are you just sit at the Starbucks and make up names and put them on the paper and go, well, I collected them. I mean, it's just, I don't know. Who are you getting to collect these signatures? Is crazy. But yeah, we're going to be all over this weekend.
Patty, only 2 years ago we saw the real wackiness of Darrell Glenn coming out of almost literally nowhere and wiping out the competition for the Senate nomination. Do you see anything of that level of craziness on Saturday?
Not that level of craziness, but first of all, I have to say, I can't believe David Kopel would disparage student councils, because anybody who was watching this show on a Friday night was no doubt on their student council.
Absolutely.
When you want to talk about wild, let's remember 8 years ago, Dan Mays came out of the Republican Party. So surprising things can happen. But the biggest surprise of the year, actually, when you talk about the people who aren't running, Ken Salazar. If he had been running, and he was always rumored to be running, and a lot of people were lining up thinking he would run as the Democratic nominee for governor, we wouldn't have the fight we're having right now in the Democratic Party. Some of those candidates were smart. I think Donna Lynn, I think all three, Polis, Donna Lynn, and Mike Johnston, they used their own volunteers to collect the petition signatures, which at least meant they knew they were from Colorado, unlike Stapleton's. It doesn't speak well for Stapleton's campaign that they couldn't figure out a better crew to hire and keep an eye on it because they knew there'd been problems before. Every time we've called his office, they always talk about how short-staffed they are, which, given the amount of money Stapleton has, doesn't make sense. But he will certainly survive. He and Cynthia Kaufman will get out. I think they'll both be on the ballot, and then we're going to have a big fight in the Republican side, both sides. They will be wild.